Hi, I'm Lily. Today I'm going to show you how to make this miniature cave home from scratch. I've used this miniature set on my last stop motion animation. If you haven't seen it yet, I'm going to put a link above and in the description below. So first I'm going to show you how I made the main structure with plywood, then how I've created the volume, the shape and the texture for the wall. I've actually created 4 walls in total, so I can be completely flexible when it comes to the animation. Then I'm going to explain how I made the floor with the crackling effect and the sunken sitting area, how I've made the ceiling, the window, the organ, and finally the little recessed light. Enjoy the video. First, I like to make some sketch for the floor plan, but also for every wall. And I taped them to some board to see how everything is going to look together in 3D. I made some adjustment to the drawing until I'm happy with it. Then I can use those sketches as templates. So I cut the windows out and also what's going to be the bed nook with an X-Acto blade. Then I use this as a template directly on a piece of 9mm plywood sheets to draw my shapes in. Then I can remove the template and cut the pieces out with the jigsaw. While I'm at it with the jigsaw, I also cut some studs. For the floor, I've used an 80mm plywood sheet and wanted to create a sunken sitting area. So I've used some leftover plywood to create some shape and layers to create the thickness that I needed. I've applied some wood glue onto it, sandwiched the pieces together and used a nail gun to hold them in place. I kept building it up until I had the top layers on and used the nail gun to hold everything together. Then I've placed my stud underneath each side of my base, line them up and use a nail gun to attach them together. Here you go, I've got my base ready with some space underneath because it's for stop motion animation and I need to access the screws underneath the puppets for the feet. To create a smooth surface inside the sunken area, I've used some wood filler, and when that was dry I used a Dremel to sand everything down. Then I start placing my walls onto the base, drill them and then screw them together. I've done the same for the second wall. And then I decided that I wanted those 2 walls to be attached together. So I've used a little metal bracket, drill and screw into the boards. And I used 3 of those metal brackets. So I have a stable attachment and I can remove those 2 walls from the set and they will hold together. Then I start building my volume. I've applied some PVA throughout my board and start building up layers of cardboard. Adding more PVA, sandwich more layers of cardboard, and not just building the same volume everywhere, but actually creating specific volume in different area. Then I apply a mat on it and press some heavy books for at least few hours, ideally overnight, for it to dry. When that was dry, I flip it over and start the same thing, layering layers of cardboard with PVA on the other side. So when that was all dry, I had volume to work with. I start cutting it first with a stainless knife, and considering the amount of layers, it wasn't strong enough. So I end up using a plastering saw, which have some really good teeth, and that went through the cardboard much more easily. And if some pieces come out while sewing into the cardboard, just stick them back with a hot glue gun. Then I start to carve with the saw into the cardboard to make sure I have much rounder edges. And every leftover or every part of cardboard that I was removing, I was sticking it back in a different spot with a hot glue gun until I had the volume I wanted. This is how it looked like at that stage. Then I cover everything with duct tape. That gives it a first skin and it's easier to see how the volume works. At that stage I can see that there was some volume missing, so I kept building with more cardboard and the hot glue gun and cover everything with duct tape. I also drilled some holes for my recessed light with the large drill bits. To create my bed nook, I've used some Worbla. If you've seen other tutorials of mine, I use this all the time. It's a thermoplastic and it's absolutely fantastic. So I use the permanent marker and create a template to follow the shape of each bed nook, a bit larger than the actual shape. I've done it twice and the second one actually even larger. Then I cut them with a scissor, warm them up with a heat gun to glue them together. I've chosen to use 2 layers, so I know that my shell is going to be much stronger and resistant. I keep warming it up with a heat gun and then apply it into the nook. And at first it was quite tricky to shape it because it's still so warm and soft, but as it started to cool down, it started to take the shape, and I used some duct tape to hold the top part in place, and that was easier to shape the rest. As you can see, I was using my hands on both sides of the wool block to make sure it followed the shape I wanted. So this is how it looks when it's completely cold and is rock solid. Then I used some foam clay. This is my favorite brand. I've used probably 2 kilos of foam clay for the whole thing. And I've covered the whole duct tape with this foam clay. This creates a second layer, much more important to get an idea of the volume. You can smooth it up with water, it helps. The whole point of this layer is not to have a perfectly smooth surface, it's just to get the volume right and the shape you want. As you can see, at that stage it's not smooth, but that's absolutely fine. I do actually like the lump, and it's more about creating an organic shape than having a perfectly smooth, impeccable surface. While that was drying, I started working on the 3rd and 4th wool. Then I've used papier-mâché. You can use whatever brands you find in your craft store. I have tried out with 2 different brands. Honestly, use whatever you find. I think I've used probably 2 kilos, more, I don't know, a lot of it. You mix it with water until you have a consistency that is workable, and then apply throughout. If you dip your finger in water, that helps smooth the whole surface. The papier-mâché has a really cool texture to it, and I thought it was really suitable to create the texture of the cave that I wanted to make. It took forever to dry. To help it dry faster, I used a heat gun here and there, but it took almost a week. Honestly, it takes a lot of time because it was quite a thick layer. So while that was drying, I started to work on the floor. First, I used a pencil and mark on the plywood where the wool were touching it. Then I've used 2 different pastes. One is a crackling effect by Pebeo, and the other one is a coarse gel by Golden. The crackling effect comes in 2 components. First, you have a primer that you need to apply and let dry for roughly 1 hour. While that was drying, I worked on the coarse gel. Overall, yes, it gave me a good texture, but it was the first time I tried it out, and for 17 pounds a little pot, I thought it was quite expensive for something that feels like sand and PVA, just a thicker version of it. So it's always good to experiment with new things, but overall my impression is just a bit too expensive for what it is. I was much more impressed with the crackling effect. I had 2 packs to use on the board, and I wish I had 3 because that goes very quickly. I've applied throughout with a palette knife, and then to remove the lines and to create a more interesting texture, I've used a sponge soaked in water. So this is what it looks like after roughly 3 days of drying. I really enjoyed the cracks, I thought it was brilliant. But the problem I've noticed is that it completely lifted from the board. So as you can see, I can move the cracking parts around. They are not held in place anymore. So that created a little bit of an issue structurally. To sort that problem, I used some Plastidip. Plastidip is a primer usually used to prime foam or used on cars, and it's got its own unique system. It creates a membrane throughout, and I thought that's perfect application for this situation because it's gonna create a membrane that holds everything together. And it did work out. So I applied 2 to 3 layers of it throughout, and for the deeper cracks where I was more concerned about, I've applied a little bit of PVA as well. When that was dry, I applied some white gesso to make sure that all the colors that will add on top will pop much more. Then I applied different shades of red, ochre, amber with paintbrush and sponges. When I was happy with it, I sealed it with a clear matte sealer. I've done a dirty wash with the diluted brown paint and removed the excess with wet paper towel. I've also did a quick dry brush with some orange and finally seal it with a clear matte sealer. Now I'm going to talk about the sealing. First, I took a piece of 9mm plywood sheets and cut a hole into it. I've also used some batten that was left over from other project and cut them to size so that I can fit all 4 corners of my board. Those batten will be helpful to make sure that the ceiling will slide into the walls. Then I place my ceiling onto the wall to make sure it fits nicely. and I went with a permanent marker to mark where all the walls end. Then I marked some point and measured the distance between the ceiling and the wall at that point, and to see if there was maybe 3 centimeters away, 2 centimeters, or even a few millimeters away. Then I marked some rough line to connect those points to the center. Then I cut some piece of cardboard at the right thickness that I measured earlier to make sure I have the volume right, and I hot glued them all along my board. Then I use a big piece of Worbla that I warm up and apply on the whole board, and I fold the inside in. I've hot glued the Worbla onto the cardboard to make sure it holds in place. Then I place my ceiling onto my walls, make sure it fits nicely, and then I went with the permanent marker again to follow the walls. It was closer to the wall than before, but it was still quite some gap. So at some point I'm gonna flip the whole thing around instead of working against gravity and use some foam clay to fill the gap. I've applied some cling film onto the wall because I didn't want the foam clay to attach to the papier-mâché, but it turned out the cling film was actually handy because I can use it to press the clay down. This served two purposes. Fill the gap was my main priority, but also made a clear line of where the wall was actually finishing. Once that foam was dry overnight, I started building up with some branches, a nice design all around my ceiling. I've hot glued the branches together and I've added more branches in the middle to cover the Worbla. Then I realized there was quite some distance between the branches and the base in Worbla, so I built up some volume with just aluminium foil and the hot glue gun to avoid having too much papier-mâché on it, so I was filling some of the void. Then I mixed up a new batch of papier-mâché, applied it everywhere. I use an old spray bottle that I filled up with water, and I spray some water throughout to soak the top surface of the papier-mâché. Then I've applied some cling film. Then I can press the cling film to smooth the surface of the papier-mâché. And then I press my branches into it. And as I was pressing the branches throughout, they were starting to dig their way into the papier-mâché and give a really nice shape to it. So then I can remove the cling film, and at that stage it was soaking wet, so I used the heat gun to help dry it up, but it still took almost a week to dry it completely. When it was completely dry, I can put my branches structure back in and hot glue it in place. Place it back onto my wall, make sure it was still fitting, and use a piece of polypropylene sheet in blue. I use it to blur what is above the sets and also diffuse the lights, and I tape it in place with duct tape. So now going back to my walls, which were dry after probably 5-6 days, something like that, I sanded down a little bit with sanding paper, but not too much. I didn't want to lose that texture. I still wanted to add a grainy texture to it, and for that I mixed some sand, proper builder sands, and PVA, and I mixed it up until I had a nice paste and apply it throughout. And it made a significant difference in terms of texture. Once it was completely dry, I applied some white gesso to prime it, and then I applied lots of different shades, different colors with a sponge. I've done some dirty wash as well, removed the excess with wet paper towel. When I was happy with it, I seal it with a clear matte sealer. Now I'm going to talk about the windows. I use a piece of paper and place it behind the wall so I can create a template for my window with a pencil. Then I've cut the template a bit larger than the actual drawing, and inside of it I start sketching the design of my window. I decide for this one to divide into 4 sections. You don't need to make it straight or even, it could be all wobbly, add actually some character to it. Then I've cut what was supposed to be the glass panel out with an X-Acto blade and used this template to copy it onto a piece of 5mm EVA foam. I wanted to add some wood grain to this foam, so I've used the X-Acto blade and create some curve into it, not all the way through the foam, but halfway through. And once you start applying some heat with a heat gun, you're gonna start to see a transformation in the foam. At the end, you can see the grain really stand out. Then I use a piece of clear Worbla and copy my template into it with a permanent marker. and cut it out with a scissor. Then I heat it up until it was soft enough and apply it onto my window and start pressing into it. As long as it's hot, it's moldable, so you can really shape it just with your finger, so you can really sculpt it as you like. So as you can see, I had my windows front and the glass that follow the exact same shape. Then I primed the foam with white gesso, apply 2 coats of acrylic paint and dry brush it for the texture. Then I use a glue gun to attach the foam to the clear Worbla. And as you might have spotted underneath, I've got another piece of polypropylene sheet in green that's going to be handy later. So I've hot glued the window into the opening. And then from the back, I've added this piece of polypropylene sheet because it's going to diffuse the light, hide what's happening outside of the set, and give a nice green color to it. Now I'm going to show you how I made the mattresses inside the bed nook. To create a template for something that is completely uneven like this, I like to use aluminium foil because you can very easily and quickly shape it into the exact form you want. I've copied this template onto 5mm EVA foam in white, cut it out. I've doubled the front part to make it look like it's thicker, make sure it was the right size, the shape, and then I've covered it with some cotton. These were old bed sheets, and I've cut the excess out, hot glue it onto the foam, and then hot glue them onto the nook. And there you go, you have a little mattress. I've also made some little shelves following the same system with the aluminium foil to create the template for each of them, paint them and hot glue them in place. They're made with balsa wood. I've created little ladders with some branches that I cut to size and hot glue them together. Once I was happy with them, I hot glued them onto the set. Now I'm going to talk about the lid organ. So to create the template, I've used the same system with aluminium foil. I've placed a ruler nearby so I knew the height that I wanted my organ to be at, so I can create the template for that specific height. Then I've cut different pieces of balsa wood to create the different layers of the organ. I've also cut some pieces for the feet, and then I assembled together with the hot glue gun. And this is how it looks all assembled. I've applied 2 coats of acrylic paint and start working on the white and black keys. I've used some matches and attached them to a piece of duct tape upside down so I can hold them in place while I paint them with white gesso and black gesso. Once it was completely dry, I cut them to size. Then I apply some clear PVA and start placing each keys one by one. Having the X-Acto knife was really handy to make sure they were placed in the correct position. I'm really happy with it. I think it looks super cute. I follow the same kind of system to create the workbench with different thicknesses of balsa wood. I've also carved some wood grain with a screwdriver to make sure it looks aged and got a bit of story to it. I've covered it with 2 coats of acrylic paints and hot glue it in place. I've also added some shelves above it. Finally, I've added some lights, and for that I needed at least 5 meters of micro LEDs per wall. I've drilled into a little nook, and from behind it I've grouped some LEDs together, probably 6 or 8 LEDs, and then pushed them into the opening. Make sure it was in the correct position, and then apply a piece of gaffer tape to hold it in place. Having those lights makes such a difference. I'm so happy that I've included them. It honestly aesthetically looks so much more interesting with those practical lights being part of the set. And then to finish it off, you need to add lots of little miniature props, furniture, everything that can bring it to life and to create the whole story. Switch on the lights, add the roof, and enjoy. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Next time I'm going to show you how to make another miniature set full of architectural trim. Take care.